Hello everyone, it's Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. In this week's episode, we bring you up to speed on the silent property crash. If you don't know what that is yet, don't worry. It is one of the most important things going on in the world of property right now that nobody is discussing. And once we've given you a quick recap on what the silent property crash is, we're going to be talking about how much further this crash has to go. I can't wait to get into this episode.
Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast. Thank you for joining us. This is where we take time out for our day jobs in property, where we did with our team over £100 million worth of property deals last year, and we share some of what we've learned along the way for free. And as an investor, of course, you want to know where property prices are going next. But it's so easy to be misled by what you see in the media and what you hear from your friends, because no one is talking about this concept of the silent property crash. So that is coming up, and make sure you stick around to the end, because in Hub Extra, we're going to be sharing some things that we do to help us absorb new ideas more effectively. Time for our news story this week, and yet more good news for the housing market, this time coming out of Rightmove, who put out a report showing that asking prices have increased by nearly 1% during February. And of course, asking prices can do what they want, but it doesn't matter if nobody is paying them. But in fact, the number of sales agreed is now higher than the same period in 2019, which is the last kind of what you'd call normal year that we have to compare to. But the most shocking thing about this data, house prices have gone up the most in London. Did not see that coming. Maybe the London gloom has been overdone. Maybe prices have come down far enough, affordability has picked up enough, and it's time for London to kick on again. I'm not convinced, but if the same pattern keeps on holding, I might have to reconsider.
The silent property crash was one of the most important episodes we put together last year because it was a crash that nobody else seemed to be talking about. The crash in question really reshapes the whole property market and gave us confidence to go against pretty much everybody else when we were making our property predictions at the beginning of the year. In this episode, we're going to remind you exactly what the silent property crash is and then give you an update on where we're at now and what the future holds. So Rob, what is the silent property crash and why is it so important to understand?
Yeah, so it sounds weird, right? How can a crash be silent? If there's a property crash, you know if there's been a property crash. It's not going to happen in the background. It's going to be all over the papers. People will be talking about it. And if nothing else, you'll just be able to look at the number. Is it higher or lower than before? But that's not necessarily the case. What we normally think of as a property crash is where the number of pounds that you need to pay for a property is lower than it was before. And that happens pretty abruptly and painfully. But it's also possible for property prices to fall quite quickly and quite dramatically in real terms, which just means after adjusting for inflation. In other words, if property prices don't fall, let's say they stay exactly the same, but the price of everything else has gone up, then in real terms, property prices have actually fallen. And at first you might be thinking, all right, well, that sounds like a bit of a mental game, a bit of a trick. Surely what matters is actually the number of pounds you have to pay. But that's not necessarily the case. Because what determines how much somebody can afford to pay for a property, in the case of owner-occupiers, and even to a degree for investment properties because wages are set by incomes, then if everyone has had a pay rise, then property at the same price is more affordable. So we did an episode on this topic and put out a video last year. You can find it by searching YouTube for Property Hub or Silent Property Crash. But Rob, we figured it was time for an update. Is the silent property crash still underway?
Well, the short answer is yes. But let's tell you by how much. So last summer, when we recorded episode 541, property prices in real terms were down 12.5%. A big fall. But now, property prices are down 15.6%. So that's another meaningful fall. And it's continued to fall. So we today see real-term prices down 15.6%. Again, this isn't being talked about. It's not being covered. The silent property crash is real, and this will impact the market. Because what is happening is you're having the best type of property crash ever. Nobody really wants a property crash. Maybe people waiting to get onto the market as an exception, but people who have properties, whether it's buy-to-lets or their own homes, they don't really like to see property prices falling. But when you have a silent property crash, it's like it's just happening in the background and no one's really noticing because inflation is masking and hiding it. But with all this taking place and with all this happening, it's making property more affordable. Because we're having a reset of prices, just nobody's noticed. And that allows the property market when this is finished, to move on and upwards again. But the key question is, when will this finish? Rob, if we continue this silent property crash, it's very easy to see how we could get to 20%, which is a significant number. Which, Rob, for comparison, the 2008 crash peak to trough was 26%, and that was deemed a catastrophic crash which shook the whole property market and the whole economy, because the property market is actually really important to the general economy. So just a bit more inflation and a few falls could see us get quite close to that number. So, Rob, the question is, will we get close? Are we going to see prices continue to fall? Or are we close to the end, or have we had the end now of the silent property crash?
Well, that is the question. And for me, the most compelling argument against further falls, in other words, saying the crash is over, property prices are not going to fall anymore, is the 2008 point. So let's say that this year, inflation runs at around 4% over the year, and property prices fall by 3 or 4%, which seems to be the consensus from most of the forecasters. Well, that would take you to very close to that 26% that we saw in 2008. This, to me, doesn't feel like a 2008 situation. Remember what was happening back then? The world financial system virtually fell apart. Lenders just stopped lending because they completely lost trust in each other and they were trying not to collapse. So prices coming down by more than that now is quite hard to imagine. And another really interesting data point to support the idea that prices aren't going to come down anymore is that prices in real terms are back to 2013 levels. So clearly, again, the actual number of pounds that you'd pay for almost any property in the UK is much higher today than it was in 2013. But in real terms, by the time we adjust for inflation, it's the same as it was back then. So there's been no movement in prices for over a decade. That is a significant correction, Rob. It's just a silent one.
It's huge, Rob. It's absolutely massive. Take that in, people. Prices are back to where they were in real terms to all the way to 2013. That's over 10 years ago. That's absolutely huge. The rebalancing of property prices that we've had is not minor. That's significant. I know I keep saying this, Rob, but I'm just absolutely flabbergasted that people aren't talking about this. When people get cornered by me and I talk about this subject because I'm really exciting, everyone's like, wow, yeah, that makes loads of sense. And wow, that is quite profound and that's going to make a difference. But why isn't it being talked about elsewhere? For me, this is absolutely huge, and it makes a big difference to what may come next.
Exactly. But it is possible that this silent property crash will continue. It may continue silently, or it may develop into an all-out nominal property crash. And there is form for this, Rob. I looked into the biggest real terms of peak-to-trough falls that we'd had in history. The biggest I could find was between 1989 and 1995, where there was a fall of 37%. So it's not impossible that we've got a lot further to go. And if you're making that argument, Rob, you'd have to be pointing at mortgage rates. The fact that rates have corrected upwards so quickly, lots of people still yet to remortgage, lots of pain left to be felt. If you're trying to make the argument for a far bigger fall, that's got to be the crux of it, right?
Yeah, that's right. If interest rates remain where they are, or even go higher, it's possible, it's not predicted, but a lot of predictions are wrong, remember, then that would have an impact. And then it would be fair to suggest that property prices could continue to fall. Maybe not a crash that you can see, but if they just fall slightly and we have inflation continuing, then the silent property crash would continue. By how much? Who knows? I think beyond that, though, Rob, we'd need to see an economic slowdown, possibly a recession for this to play out further. Because between 89 and 1995, it wasn't just a bad time for property prices, but it was a bad time for the UK economy. And the economy at the moment is doing okay. I don't think anyone would suggest that things are brilliant right now, but it's not awful. And although a recession could happen this year, I think it's more likely not to happen. I don't think many people are forecasting a recession this year. There's a chance of it, but most experts would say it's unlikely. So for us to see the silent property crash continue, we would need interest rates to at least stay where they are. That increase the pain on people remortgaging, which may in turn then hurt the property market. And for it to be more aggressive to become a '08 style crash or a '89 style crash, we would need to see the UK economy falter. At the moment, the latter is unlikely to happen. And for interest rates, well, I think we're all going to have a good idea of where we stand and what direction they're heading by the summer. So we're not going to have long to wait to understand if the silent property crash is going to continue. We're not saying that right now this is the last month of the silent property crash, but I certainly feel, Rob, comfortable in saying that we've got the last few months of the silent property crash and it's going to tail off now. That's what I believe, but what do you think?
Well, like I said back at the beginning, if you take the consensus position about what people think are going to happen with nominal property prices, then a continuation of the silent crash is baked in, because inflation is definitely not going to be lower than 2%. It could come in for the year at 3 or 4%. And most forecasters would probably be astonished if property prices increased by 3 or 4% to keep pace with that. Most people believe that they're going to fall over the year. But I do think it's possible that we're going to get those bigger gains in prices this year. I predicted movement of at least 4% in one direction or the other, basically saying it's either going to be a really good year for property or something horrendous is going to happen, nothing in between. So if the more positive of those scenarios plays out, then that would be the end of the silent property crash. Prices would have bottomed, inflation more or less back under control, and room for confidence to return and prices to kick on again. So it's a long way of saying that, yes, I think it's too early to say, but my current guess would be that is it now. The silent property crash is over. But as we often caveat when we get to the end of one of these episodes, very much depends where you're buying.
I think property prices in the UK right now are at a really, really interesting place. And we intend to talk about this very subject next month when we've got a little bit more data to work with. But that is an episode you're definitely going to want to listen to. So if you've not subscribed yet, make sure you do. And if you haven't shared the podcast yet, then we need to have a chat. Because it's time, ladies and gentlemen, before we give you our Hub Extra, to talk about our handshake deal. Because we love producing the podcast. We've done it week in, week out for over 10 years. Never missed a week, and we don't intend to miss one. But we now are asking after all this time for something in return. Because to grow the property podcast, for us to have the biggest impact that we can possibly have, we need you to share the podcast. So if you've listened to a few episodes or more now, then it's time for you to share the podcast. Send the link of this podcast or others, or your favourite podcast, maybe the original Silent Property Crash episode, send it to some people and recommend that they listen to it. If they listen to that episode alone, they're going to be better off. But if they go on to subscribe, well, then we grow the podcast. So the deal is, if you've listened to a few episodes or more now, it's time for you to do your bit. It's time for you to give back. So share the podcast. And once you've shared it, why not subscribe to our YouTube channel as well to make us extra happy? And for those who are doing this, we can see a meaningful difference in the numbers. Thank you. So well done to you, and to everyone else. I'm putting my hand out to you. I'm looking you in the eye. Let's do a handshake deal.
Okay, so I'm assuming everyone who that was directed at has paused the episode, gone and done that, and now they're back, so we can now carry on with Hub Extra, the part of the show where we give you that little bit more, whether it's a book, a resource, a quote, something to make your life a little bit better or easier. And I've got one this week, Rob, which is a bit of a life hack and maybe a little bit sneaky, but I'm recording this looking at a big stack of books that I haven't read. Because the number of times you're having a conversation with someone, they recommend a book, you order it, so easy to order a book, it arrives, you put it on your desk, and you just never get to it. But I have a solution to this, which is don't read the book. Forget about reading the book. Just listen to an interview with the author. And this works particularly well for business books or self-improvement kind of books, where normally there's one main idea that the book is based around. And then around that idea, you just got examples and more detail and all the rest of it. If you just find a long-form podcast interview with the author, which they've recorded around the time of the book coming out, they will basically tell you the book. They'll tell you the big idea of the book. They'll give you the most compelling examples. And then you pretty much know it. And if you're absolutely gripped, then you can go and read the book to reinforce it. But if not, you can just go, oh, yeah, fair enough. I know it now. And it's maybe taking you 1 hour rather than the 10 hours it would have taken you to read or listen to the book. There's a tool which I'm sure we've mentioned before. If not, we should have done. It's called Listen Notes, listennotes.com, which is basically a podcast search directory. So if you search for the author's name in there, it'll bring up all the interviews that they've done. You can sort it either by date or the most popular. Pick one out of there. Job done. Reading saved.
I love that, Rob. But I'm going to give a twist to your Hub Extra. And that is, if you've read a book and it's a pretty heavy going book, so I'll give you a real example, Outlive. I really enjoyed that book, but it's pretty heavy going. So I wanted to make sure I captured the main ideas from the book and I wanted it to be reinforced. So after reading the book, I actually then went and listened to podcast interviews by Dr. Peter Attia and heard him talk about the book. The podcasts he tends to go on as well are long podcasts. So I've listened to this man quite extensively now. But for a book that you found super valuable and you want to make sure you've extracted all the goodness out of it, then following up with podcast interviews is also a great hack. So whether you can't be bothered to read the book or you want to double down on a book, this Hub Extra has got you covered.
I really like that. So I guess the Hub Extra is use podcast interviews to enhance your reading experience in one way or another, which is a bit more generous than my original, just don't read books. So I like how you've refined the idea a little bit there. That is us done for this week, though. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. We like to make Thursdays the centrepiece of your property week, but there is so much more. There's Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesdays. There's the Property Pulse newsletter on Fridays. Make sure you subscribe to that if you're not already at propertyhub.net/pulse. And we're in the Sunday Times on Sunday. So always loads of good stuff coming up. But until we see you next, have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.